Hello and welcome to a additional episode of the Crime and Punishment Review and Recap series for our YouTube channel. In the next couple of videos we're going to be looking at how do you answer different types of crime and punishment questions. You've gone away and you've learned all of the content, but the important bit now is how do you apply that to the actual exam. And we're going to start off by looking at the first longer written answer, which will be a 9-mark question. Just a reminder, there will be 3 1-mark questions on the crime and punishment paper, but as these are just really short, simple, one-word or short phrase answers, there's no point doing a video entirely on these. So I thought it would be best to start off with the first long proper written answer, which is the 9-mark question. So what do you need to do for a 9-mark question? Well, the first step for any GCSE question, whether it's a 9-mark question, a 10-mark question, or whether it's on a completely different paper, is to work out what the question is actually asking you. And for this, I've got an example of what a 9-mark question will look like below. Now, a 9-mark question will always start with the prefix, write a clear and organized summary of, and then it will say here, either crime and criminals, punishment, or law enforcement. You need to highlight this particular theme because this is what you are going to need to refer to with examples throughout your answer. So make sure you highlight this so you know exactly what kind of examples you need, whether it's for crime, punishment, or law enforcement. It will then say in the period ... This is where there will be one of 4 different sets of dates. It will either say 1250 to 1500, 1500 to 1750, 1750 to 1900, or 1900 to present. Again, you are going to need to highlight this because this is where you are going to need to extract your relevant examples from in the history of crime and punishment. Now, you will notice here, it doesn't necessarily say the medieval period or the early modern period or the industrial period. That's because you need to go away and learn those dates for each of those 4 key time periods off by heart. So make sure as part of your revision, you are learning the dates of the different time periods as well as the names of the different time periods. So you're highlighting whether it's crime, punishment, or law enforcement, and you're highlighting the time period that it is from. So what do you need to do once you've worked out the focus? Well, this is where you need to now start planning, and this is where your retrieval knowledge from all of your revision is going to come in useful. So how many examples are you going to need to include in a 9-mark question? Well, you're going to need 2 examples of the relevant theme, crime, punishment, or law enforcement, from the relevant time period, medieval, early modern, industrial, or modern. So if we take a look at an example question, say the question was on law enforcement in the period 1500 to 1750. Now, we know from our revision that that's the early modern period. So what examples can we retrieve from our long-term memory of law enforcement in the early modern period? Well, we know that assizes, which is a type of court, became increasingly more important during this time period. We know that watchmen were employed more in towns and cities, and we know that justices of peace, or JPs, increased in power as the role of the sheriff declined. Once you've got those examples in your head from your revision and from your long-term memory, you need to start thinking about, well, what do I need to actually do with those examples in my answer? So what skills am I going to need to demonstrate to the examiner? Well, this 9-mark question is all about description to begin with. So you need to describe the example, including your specific knowledge from your revision. So that could be things such as dates of new laws or new crimes, statistics, key names of individual people or books that influence laws. For example, you could talk about the 1531 Jail Act, which means in this particular time period more prisons were built. Or in 1609, you've got the Vagabond Act, which changes the way that we punish vagrants and vagabonds in towns and villages. So these are examples of specific detail that you need to use to build up your answer. And the most important part of this 9-mark question is to do with the analysis of that example. So you've identified it, you've described it, and now you need to analyze it. And this is where you need to include what is called a second order concept. So what do I actually mean by a second order concept? What does that term mean? Well, a second order concept are things that examine history in a deeper context than just facts, dates, and statistics. So we talked about in the previous slide, you need some supporting details such as facts and details and statistics. That's true, but you need to go beyond that in a 9-mark question. And there are 6 main second order concepts that you could use in your different examples depending on what the example is that you've talked about. Now, not all of these examples, these second order concepts, need to be used in every single paragraph of your 9-mark question. For some examples, some second order concepts will be more relevant than other examples, and it's up to you as part of your revision to try and work out which ones fit best where. So what examples have we got? Well, one of the first and the biggest second order concepts that we look at in history is what causes things, and it's to do with cause. So what caused this event? Was it multiple factors leading to one outcome? Which of those different factors was the most important in deciding that outcome? You've also got, on the flip side of that, consequence. So what were the consequences of a certain event or action? What did it lead to? Again, which of those consequences were the most important? Was there just one, or was there lots of different ones that had different weighting? You could also look at examples of change between different time periods. So is this example, this event that you are talking about, is this an example of a change compared to a previous time period? Was this something new and different that we hadn't seen before in previous time periods? Again, on the flip side of that, you've got continuity. Is this example similar to things that had happened prior? Is it the same, or has it changed in terms of change, or has it stayed the same in terms of consequence? And why has it changed if it has changed? You've then got significance. What was the importance of this particular event? Why do we as historians care about it? What does it tell us about this time period? And lastly, diversity. Were the experiences the same for everybody at this particular time? Are there different experiences for people in different social classes? Or different sort of ethnic backgrounds as we get into the more modern period? How did different people in different areas experience these changes or continuity? Now, you don't need to explicitly say, I am going to be talking about cause or significance or change, but it's important that in your examples, you are alluding to these one of these second order concepts, because this is what's going to get you those top marks in a 9-mark answer. So let's actually have a look at some examples of where you could include a second order concept. Below are a series of statements. What I would like you to do is read through each of them in the grey boxes, and I would like you to decide which second order concept is being displayed. So pause the video here, have a read through them, and then see in your head if you can work out which of those second order concepts you think are being displayed in each of the examples. And then we'll come back together and we'll have a read through them. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to pause the video and read through each of those. What we'll do now is we'll have a quick read through each of them, and then we'll talk about which of the different second order concepts are being displayed in these statements. So if we read the first one, it says, in the Middle Ages, land was the basis of all wealth. Most people were poor. Prisons or jails were used to keep debtors and people in debt, and the prisoners had to pay the jailer for bedding, food and drink, making it very difficult for such prisoners to escape the cycle of debt. So if you were poor, as most people were in the Middle Ages, and you end up in debt, you go to jail. In jail, you have to pay for everything for the jailer. That means that you are more in debt than you were before, and that cycle continues and you have to stay there. So what is the second order concept on show here? Well, because they're talking about the reasons why people end up in jail in this particular time period, it's an example of cause. But because that cause then leads to the cycle of debt, which means that they stay in prison for even longer, they're also displaying consequence here. The consequence of being in debt is that you go to jail. Okay, so that's an example of cause and consequence. The second one, in the early Middle Ages, there were variations on hangings. Before 1350, local variations included being thrown from the cliffs of Dover or buried alive at Sandwich. Well, because this one is talking about different forms of capital punishment in different areas, this is an example of diversity. In different periods in the early Middle Ages, you would have faced different punishments for similar crimes. Therefore, it's an example of diversity within capital punishment at this time. Third one, JPs increasingly gained power and overtook the role of sheriffs. Well, this is an example of change. In the end of the Middle Ages period and going into the early modern period, we know justices of peace become increasingly powerful compared to the previous time period where sheriffs had more power in their local areas. Therefore, this is an example of how things in law enforcement change at the end of the Middle Ages and going into the early modern period. Responsibility for upholding the law remained the responsibility of the public. Because it is talking about things staying the same between the Middle Ages and the early modern period, this is an example of continuity. Throughout the early periods that we look at, the responsibility for upholding the law stays the responsibility of the public. And it's not until the end of the industrial period that we start to get a professional police force that take that responsibility away from the public. So this statement is demonstrating continuity. Now, you will see in these statements that they haven't explicitly necessarily stated this is an example of diversity or consequence or whatever it might be, but they have implicitly talked about some of these second order concepts, and it's in your answers that you need to be thinking about, well, what can I include that displays one of these second order concepts? So how should I actually go about writing my answer? So you've worked out the focus, you've developed a plan. Now is the difficult bit. You need to actually start writing it. So the best way to start any of your answers for any of your questions across GCSE history is to use the wording of the question. That means that your answers are immediately going to be direct and succinct and go straight to the point, and you're not going to spend any time waffling, going on about things that aren't relevant. So if the question was, write a clear and organised summary of law enforcement in the period 1500 to 1750, I would start off with one example of law enforcement, because that's the theme, in the early modern period, because that's the time, was ... And then I would identify an example of law enforcement at this time from my revision. Then you need to actually include some of your subject knowledge. So if we think back to our developing of the plan, what supporting detail do we have of that identified point I've just made? And this is where you need to describe it a little bit. So this was where, and I would include dates, statistics, what it actually was, a short summary of what it is that I'm talking about here. Then, once you have described and included your subject knowledge, you need to provide some analysis, including the second order concepts that we've just talked about. Now, I've said that you don't need to explicitly say what the second order concept is, but you might find it useful to include some of the following sentence starters to help guide your answers into different second order concepts. So you could talk about, for change, this was significant or a moderate example of change compared to the previous time period, so the Middle Ages period in this example, because ... and then explain why it's a big change or a significant change. Continuity, this was an example of continuity with the Middle Age period because ... Diversity, this was not the same for everyone or everywhere due to ... and then you could talk about the different experiences of different people, depending on maybe social class or where they were in the country. Consequence, this led to important changes or consequences such as ... because, so what actually led to that? Cause, this was caused by multiple factors, for example, and then you could talk about them. Significance, this was a somewhat moderate, significant, depending on how important you think it is, event because ... and then you could explain why. So those are just some examples of analysis that you could include. Again, you don't need to specifically state them, but if you find that more straightforward, then by all means that is okay as well. So how will my answer actually be marked once I've written it? Well, you've got the mark scheme up on the screen on the left-hand side. So this is what the examiners will use to judge the quality of your answer. For 1 to 3 marks, if you just list events in the time period or describe the event with no second order concept analysis, so none of those second order concepts mentioned in your answer, then you won't get more than 3 marks. And this is a common pitfall that lots of GCSE candidates fall into because they don't include some sort of analysis. If you identify, describe and analyse one relevant example, you will get 4 to 6 marks depending on the quality of it. And if you do that twice, you will get 7 to 9 marks depending on, again, the quality of your answer. So let's have a look at an example answer to the question of write a clear and organised summary of law enforcement in the periods 1500 to 1750. On the board has flashed up an example answer. What I would like you to do is pause the video here. I would like you to read through the answer and I would like you to decide in your head where you think this would fit on our mark scheme. You might find it beneficial to make a little note, maybe on a piece of paper, or if you've got an iPad, you could screenshot it and you could highlight where they have identified a method of law enforcement in this period, where they've described it and included some detail, and where they have analysed it. Okay, so pause the video here and then we'll discuss where this fits on our mark scheme in a second. Okay, let's have a look at the answer then. So it says, one example of law enforcement in the early modern period would be hanging a criminal to death. This was used for those who committed serious crimes, such as murder or rape. This was carried out in public to ensure as many people as possible saw it, as a reminder of what would happen to those who broke the rules. This was because there was no effective organised police force at the time. Right, there is a problem with this initial paragraph, and hopefully you have spotted that when you were reading the answer. The problem with this paragraph is that it doesn't actually talk about law enforcement in the period 1500 to 1750. It talks about hanging a criminal to death, and from our revision we know that hanging was not a form of law enforcement upholding the law and catching criminals. It was a way of punishing criminals who had broken the law. So immediately, even though they accurately describe what hanging criminals to death was in this period, it's not answering the question. It's not asked you to talk about punishment in this period, it's asked you to talk about law enforcement. So this isn't a relevant example, so therefore they're still at 0 marks, and all of the rest of that paragraph can't be credited. Let's see if they can claw it back in their second example. So they say another example of law enforcement in the early modern period was the increased employment of watchmen in towns by local authorities. Right, hopefully then you have spotted the identified point here. The identified point that they are making about law enforcement in this period is that there are more watchmen in towns in the early modern period. What we would be looking for now is if they go on to describe what watchmen were, or some supporting detail about this particular example. So they say watchmen were introduced in the medieval period and were responsible for handing over criminals to the constable in the morning. Right, this is description. They are telling us the job of the watchmen at this particular period. Okay, so again, they've got some description here. Now what we're looking for is, well, can they include any more description, or are they going to start talking about a second order concept here? So they say this was caused by multiple factors. During the early modern period, urbanisation had begun to take place, with 1/5 of people living in London by 1750. Additionally, the population of England grew from 2.4 million to 4.1 million between 1500 and 1600. This meant the authorities required more patrols on the streets in towns to arrest the growing number of criminals operating in these areas at night, such as thieves and vagabonds. Therefore, more watchmen were employed in these areas. Right, their second order concept then is the fact that they are talking about what caused more watchmen to be employed. And again, they back this up with supporting detail. They talk about the fact that the population has grown and there are now more people living in towns such as London than there ever were before in different time periods. They said that population rose up to 4.1 million in the space of 100 years. And then they go on to talk about the consequence of that. Well, because there are more people in towns, there is more crime going on. So therefore, they need more watchmen to try and bring down these rising levels of crime in this time period. So because they talk about these second order concepts after they have described and identified a relevant example of law enforcement in the period 1500 to 1750, they immediately get themselves into that second band, which is 4 to 6 marks, because they have identified, described and analysed one relevant example, which is watchmen for the time period. Now, I would argue this is quite a good description and analysis of watchmen in this period, so I would put this at the top of that bracket, which is more towards the 6 out of 9 marks. If they had successfully done that for the first one, if they'd identified a relevant point for the first one and described it and analysed it, then they'd be looking at more like 7 to 9 marks. But because they only get one relevant example, they're in 6 marks there. So be really careful to make sure that your examples are actually answering the question. Have you definitely included the right theme, crime, punishment, law enforcement? Have you definitely got the right time period? And the simple way to make sure that you've got that right is to do your revision properly. Test yourself and make sure you know exactly what is happening in each of the different time periods. So that's it for the 9-mark question. Hopefully you found that useful. If you do have any more questions, you can always talk to your class teacher about this. If you would like to have a go at any examples as well, you are welcome to. Again, talk to your class teacher about that. He'll be happy to talk you through some different examples. Okay. Hopefully you found that useful. Look out for the next video in which we're going to talk about how to answer the 10-mark question. Thank you for watching.